Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to my latest episode of the Beginner's Guide series. I've done this for a couple prog bands this year, for Jethro Tull, for Rush, for Yes, and now I'm doing it for Emerson, Lake and Palmer. That's the prog band of the month, and I like to do a little bit of an introduction to them, a brief history of the band and what I think would be a good starting point for a new fan. And allow a space for people to chime in on the comments for how they discovered the group and for what their recommendations are for a new listener. I try to gear this a little bit towards like people who are coming in who have no idea about these prog bands but are wanting to explore it a little bit deeper. But it's also a way to just talk in general about a band I really love and to get some conversation going in the comments. And I know a lot of people watching this are already well-established ELP fans, so hopefully it'll be interesting and entertaining to you to see my perspective of the group and what I think about them in general. So first off, a little brief biography of the group and their history. They're basically a supergroup that came together in 1970. They brought together the forces of Greg Lake, who came from King Crimson, Carl Palmer, who came from Atomic Rooster, and Keith Emerson, who came from The Nice. So we got this cool trio of musicians who are all experts in their particular instruments, really virtuosos, and coming together to create this really fascinating sound with a lot of different elements to it. And they bring a lot of different things to the table. Keith Emerson most notably brings a bit of a classical vibe to the music. He's really into classical music. He's a classically trained pianist. And a lot of ELP's sound comes from that, where they cover some of these classical pieces, but do it in a proggier, more lively manner. And that's a really fascinating sound for them. Their core, to me, of classic albums was their first 4 records, which are their self-titled record, Tarkus, Trilogy, and then Brain Salad Surgery. 4 classics in progressive rock that are pretty untouchable, that I think most prog fans would agree are heralded as some of the best in progressive rock music. Then things, went a little off the rails slightly, perhaps, depending on your perspective, but they did the Works albums, which were a little bit disjointed in my mind, at least, where each band member kind of took their own side of the record to do their own stuff and came together on the last side of the record to do a couple pieces together as a full group. And Works Volume 2 was a little bit of a smattering of extras and outtakes from their career up to this point, so didn't feel like a fully fledged new album from the group. And then Love Beach came along, which was not really well regarded by most of the diehard prog fans, so to speak, kind of a controversial album cover perhaps, and them leaning a bit into some more poppier directions as they entered the later 70s. So a little bit of petering out towards the end of the 70s, I'd say. And then they did a couple of interesting different configurations in the 80s. We got Emerson, Lake and Powell because Carl Palmer wasn't available because he was a member of Asia at the time, so they brought in Cozy Powell to round out the trio in a very interesting 80s style album. Then they had this interesting group 3, which brought in Robert Barry to replace Greg Lake, brought back Carl Palmer, and then of course Emerson was still part of that as well. So they did an album together as that trio, and then they reformed as the full Emerson, Lake and Palmer for a couple albums in the 90s with the albums Black Moon and In the Hot Seat. So that was basically the end, at least for their studio albums. And then unfortunately in 2016, Keith Emerson and Greg Lake passed away, and now Carl Palmer is the only remaining living member of ELP. So but they're just a fantastic group that really showed off their virtuosity, had some really big epic pieces of music. They have these big long form songs such as Tarkus, the title track of their second release, and of course Carnival 9 as well on Brain Salad Surgery, amongst many other pieces of music. I find them interesting because they have these really classic, interesting progressive rock tracks, but then they also have these really bouncy, quirky, weird kind of tracks that are more poppy or more old school style saloon music, or something quirky and funny and offbeat and off the wall. So they have an interesting smattering of different types of music that they delve into throughout their releases. And of course, they always tend to have these classical pieces, but done in a prog style. And they're just a really fun group. So another cool aspect to them is their showiness and their theatricality on stage. And so if you combine this virtuosity and them really shining on their instruments and delving into these different styles of music that focus on classical and jazz music and prog, of course, and combine that with this like theatrical, like stage antics and things like that, which is not too unfamiliar to other prog bands at that time. Look at Genesis and the kind of theatricality of Peter Gabriel. I think that was just a piece of the prog scene at the time. And you get a really fascinating artist that is one of the big names in the progressive rock space for good reason, and have some really incredible albums from that early 70s period. And that's really where I'd steer a new listener towards, is those early records, those 4 records that I mentioned, their first 4. I would just start at the beginning of them with their self-titled release. I think their self-titled really showcases the band and all that they're able to do. There's some really cool pieces that spotlight each of the different members, some moments that spotlight the incredible drum work, some really cool laid-back, more ballady pieces that showcase Greg Lake's vocals, and then some really showy keyboard virtuosity and classical pieces that showcase Keith Emerson's side and what he brings to the table. It's all there just on their first record, and is one of the most consistent records that they produced. But any of those first 4 records are really great starting points. I love Trilogy. I think Brain Salad Surgery is an established classic in the genre and not a bad starting point either. I'd probably avoid getting into Works because it's so disjointed and strange, to me at least as a new listener, because each band member gets their own side, and it doesn't really showcase the band as a full entity to its fullest ability. But it is interesting as just an experiment to like see the different sides to the band and how they come together. I think that's an interesting concept, but maybe not the best place to start. And of course, Love Beach is probably not the best place either, because many people just don't consider it to be very representative of ELP at their best. And their later era albums are more just kind of these reunion records that don't really stand on their own very well, in my opinion, without knowing their history and their past. So really stick with those first 4 records. Start with the self-titled debut, I think, and just move forward from there. If you really want to, I don't think it's such a problem to start with Brain Salad Surgery either. Just to really get into their classic record and see what they're all about also. So that's what I do with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. For me, my history, this isn't a band that my dad was hugely into. I think he's aware of them and knew some of their music, but it's more of a band that I've come to appreciate in my own discovery of progressive music and wanting to gain a solid foundation in the classic prog artists. And I felt like this was one of them that I should definitely have a footing with. And I'm glad I did, and I'm delving even deeper into them for this month, and hopefully you guys enjoy the content that's coming. I'm going to be doing an album ranking, probably giving away a little bit of my takes on their catalog throughout this video, but you'll get the more nuanced take of how I feel about each individual album and where it sits in my ranking for them. And I'm hoping to do a reaction with Jana to some classic ELP stuff as well throughout the month. So it should be a fun month with some classic ELP material. So thank you guys for joining me. Let me know in the comments your thoughts about ELP and all that they do. And hopefully you'll stick around for future episodes. Thank you, everybody. Bye.